Hello class and welcome to a new analysis of Coming by Philip Larkin. Coming is a short lyric poem by Philip Larkin about the approach of spring, observed on an ordinary evening in an ordinary street. Its main themes are anticipation, renewal, and the possibility of happiness without understanding. The poem appeared in Larkin's 1955 collection, The Less Deceived. Before we begin the poem itself, let us look at the title. Coming is an ellipsis. It is a present participle with no subject and no object. One might ask, coming of what? But these questions are left unanswered by the title. Let's start with the first stanza. I'll leave you a moment to read the first section of the first stanza, which I have separated quite arbitrarily, before I begin my own analysis. So as you have read in these lines, a cold yellow evening falls over calm house fronts while a thrush sings from a laurel bush in an empty garden. The first device we meet is synesthesia. Light, a visual phenomenon, is described through touch, with chill. So the two senses here are blended into one image so that the reader feels the cold brightness of a late winter evening. The poem is therefore immersive from the outset. Next comes personification. Light bathes the houses like a gentle hand washing a face. We can tell that we are in a transition point between winter and spring, as we have this cold chill, but we also have light and sunlight bathing the houses. But the verb bathe really has a connotation. It seems tender and cleansing, which suggests that the world is being renewed, prepared for spring. The urban scene is quietly being transfigured and prepared for spring. And so this personification quietly flows into a metaphor. The house fronts become foreheads, calm human faces. So here it is obvious that whilst Larkin wants to refer to the house fronts, he used the word foreheads. The adjective serene deepens this. The houses seem peaceful and almost meditative. Larkin makes a dull suburban street feel alive and receptive to the coming season. Renewal reaches even the most unremarkable places. And now notice the indefinite article. It is not a famous nightingale, not the thrush, but just a thrush who is singing. A thrush is one of the most ordinary birds living in England. Larkin deliberately lowers the register of the romantic bird poem. The next device is compound adjective in laurel surrounded. The bird sings from inside laurel. A laurel is a classical plant of poetry and poetic triumph. Then we find an oxymoron in deep bare garden. Deep suggests richness and depth, whilst bare states winter emptiness. The garden holds both things at once. Sure, it is stripped of leaves and barren because of the winter, but it is full of potential which will flourish in the spring. The pairing enacts the threshold moment of the poem. Whilst winter is still visible, spring is already implied. And this section of this first stanza ends with hyperbole. The song is so vivid that even the inert brick is astonished. The exaggeration measures the power of the song against the deadest and most man-made material imaginable. But we might also feel some irony creeping in with this exaggeration. I'm personally getting the sense that Larkin is presenting the scene as the picture-perfect winter scene just before the arrival of spring. It is bright but still cold, with the garden with huge potential to blossom over the spring, and an angelic voice of a bird which is astonishing even the brickwork. It just feels that Larkin is being ironic or sarcastic, if you will. And perhaps by presenting this stereotypically perfect image of an early spring or late winter scene, he is perhaps poking fun at how idealized this season is. It is always presented as this time of rebirth, of novelty, of new beginnings, and of growth. And it just feels like Larkin is poking fun at this. And I think that this will become much more apparent in the second part of the first stanza. As always, I'll leave you a moment to read this second section and form your own opinion before I begin the analysis. As you have read, the thrush's message becomes explicit. Spring is almost here. The speaker, though, whose childhood was a forgotten boredom, feels like a child stumbling on adults, making peace and understanding nothing but the laughter and beginning to be happy. As I mentioned, the first device is the refrain. The repetition of this same phrase, "it will be spring soon," enacts the song of the thrush. And this part really illustrates how the thrush is a herald, an announcer of the upcoming season. So this repetition is really the refrain of what seems to be the thrush's song, announcing the upcoming season. However, this repetition could also be the speaker himself talking in an excited manner. Perhaps this repetition illustrates his eagerness at the arrival of this season. Within the refrain, however, notice the modal verb. Everything in the poem so far has been present tense. However, the will be points forward. Spring is not here, it is promised. Then comes the volta, marked by the dash at the end of line 11. The dash suspends the poem and pivots it. Up to this point, the poem describes the outer world. After the dash, however, it turns inward, as you can see by the next words, which are "and I." So this is the structural hinge of the poem. So as I mentioned, after that turn, we meet the personal pronoun. The speaker enters the poem for the first time and only in line 11. The delay perhaps tells us that he is an observer, hesitant to place himself at the center. Next, look at the diction. The diction of forgotten boredom is a bleak admission of his childhood's monotony. Immediately after this comes a simile. The speaker, who has just dismissed childhood, compares himself to a child. And him comparing himself to a child shows how spring is a way for people to turn a new leaf, to forget their past, to go back in time and overcome their past hardships. And once again, Larkin is really insisting on this stereotypical vision of spring as this cure-all season, which transports people into a universe of rebirth and new beginnings and turning over new leaves. It really feels like he's being ironic. What he's actually trying to communicate is that spring is actually a season of false hope and false optimism. Or at least that's what it seems like to me. And so this child comes on a scene of his parents, well, presumably his parents or adults around him, reconciling. So reconciling suggests that there has been a quarrel between the adults, that the poem never shows. The fact that it isn't shown perhaps shows how the child doesn't really understand the arguments in its entirety. The child arrives only for the peace and not the conflict. By analogy, because remember this is all a simile, the speaker, so the adult speaker, receives spring's happiness, joy, and rebirth, all the while neglecting his past tumult. He totally forgets his past hardships and feels like a child whose parents have just reconciled. The next device is negation in can understand nothing. So this strips the child and the speaker of all comprehension. Understanding is therefore presented as unnecessary for happiness. It is unnecessary to understand or to dwell on the hardships of winter in order to enjoy the spring. Past troubles do not constrain future bliss. But it is the unusual laughter that really makes me think that Larkin actually associates spring with a false sense of optimism and security. The unusual laughter of the child's parents indicate that perhaps this quarrel, this bickering, hasn't really been resolved. The adults seem to have only changed their tune once their child arrived and tried to make themselves seem reconciled, even though the initial fallout remains. Spring is perhaps presented as a false and toxic and untruthful false optimism, where people are carried away with the greenery and deliberately decide to sweep all their problems under the rug. It seems that Larkin is really parodying spring. Spring isn't this magical season where all problems seem to evaporate. They are well and truly still there. They haven't been overcome. But let's go back to the literal analysis of the poem so the child can understand nothing but the unusual laughter. So this coordinating conjunction but provides an exception. Emotion is received directly, before and without meaning. But perhaps that is exactly why the parents are laughing unusually in order to fabricate this reconciliation when it isn't actually true. It isn't effective. Finally, the section is bound together by polysyndeton. The repeating "and" links the final movement into one long accumulating sentence. The clauses pile up gently, mimicking the gradual way the feeling grows. The feeling of felicity and happiness grows within the speaker. But one is left questioning whether this happiness is actually genuine and true. Let's move on to structure, form, and rhythm. Structurally, the poem falls into two movements hinged on the volta, the dash in line 11, which I mentioned. First of all, we have an outward movement describing the evening, the houses, and the thrush. Then we have an inward movement turning to the speaker's own feeling. The structure enacts the poem's meaning. The external promise of spring produces an internal happiness. In terms of form, this is a single verse paragraph of 19 lines with no stanza breaks, mirroring one continuous moment of perception and one unbroken train of thought. Rhythmically, the poem is a free verse with short lines of roughly 2 beats, creating a delicate and hesitant pace. And on that note, let's move on to the conclusion. So, to conclude, 2 main themes really emerge from the poem. The first is happiness without understanding. The simile of the child at the scene of adult reconciling argues that joy does not require comprehension. The speaker can understand nothing but the unusual laughter. But that unusual laughter is enough for him to get infected by this happiness and joy. It is unnecessary to understand or to dwell on the hardships of winter in order to enjoy the spring. Just as the child receives the laughter without knowing the quarrel that preceded it, the speaker receives spring's joy without needing to revisit what came before. Spring is therefore presented as a blank page, which enables people to turn a new leaf and forget their past troubles. It is a fresh page, a new beginning. However, I believe that Larkin is actually being ironic in this presentation of spring. He obviously tried to paint this stereotypically idyllic picture of spring with luscious plants, beautiful bird songs, and wonderful suburban landscapes. It is clear that Larkin is trying to make an idealized version of spring. And perhaps that is because he believes that this idea that spring fixes all our problems is quite naive. The quarrel between the child's parents wasn't actually resolved and overcome. The parents just feigned to reconcile in order to cheer up their son. The second theme is the ecstasy of anticipation. In this poem, spring never actually arrives, but the refrain, "It will be spring soon and the future will," locate the poem's happiness in expectation. For Larkin, happiness is situated mostly in the anticipation of good times rather than in the actual experience of them. The poem ends not with joy being achieved, but with joy beginning. The speaker only starts to be happy. The promise of a spring, the promise of novelty, is what produces the feeling, as if expectation itself were the pleasure. And so once again, Larkin is criticizing people who put too much weight on hope, on expectation, who rely on the hope of a better future in order to be happy. He believes that the simple expectation of a better life with the coming of spring is just naive. And on that quite melancholy note, thank you so much for following my analysis. Please like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you in the next one.